Day 9, I believe this is the end of week 7, this one. So we're going to be looking at preventing the spread of communicable diseases, so preventing viruses, bacteria and fungi and other infections from spreading. I think you're probably quite well versed in this at the moment. If you're interested in the history behind this, because there's quite a lot of history, I'll put a link to the Radiolab podcast about one of the people we're talking about today. So this is preventing infections. Let's crack on. You don't need to print the slides. Don't panic. So this is, you can do either of these. Remember, recapping your own knowledge is really, really important. So maybe 3 keywords from last lesson that were useful to you. I think Mr. Deaton is recording your last lesson right now. So I would suggest that you were doing it on infections. I think a really good summary of that is maybe consider talking about how viruses and bacteria actually cause illness, in terms of bacteria causing toxins, etc., or the 3 diseases for each you have to learn. So for viruses, HIV, mosaic virus, and measles, for example. So you're going to need to pause this, go back and have a look at your notes and repeat a few of them. So today's lesson, we're going to be looking at how the spread of disease can be prevented or certainly reduced. We're certainly going through a huge state in the middle of a world pandemic to do this, so this one should be slightly easier for you. So everyone needs to be able to say how they spread and how we can stop them, or how you can communicate to the public how you prevent the spread of disease. Describe how it can be reduced and presented, and explain how that has changed over time. And then for our top odds, which everyone can achieve with this today, is use scientific knowledge to explain in detail how methods reduce or prevent the spread of infection, using examples to explain how scientific method has been applied. Okay, again, this is very much in the zeitgeist, so you probably will know quite a lot. Quite a lot of this is common sense, but then there's quite a lot of history behind it, so quite a lot of new stuff to learn. Now, this is, those of you that are history students will be very used to having a look at a photo and seeing what you can deduce from this. This is a photo of surgery taking place in the 1800s. Patients regularly died from infection after surgery. Can you suggest reasons for this? So just have a look at this photo. I mean, for one, you would not expect surgery to be occurring in anything other than a sterile theatre. None of these nurses or doctors are wearing masks. You can't see loads here, but you can see that their hands are being used. There's no gloves being used. Whilst the nurses are wearing aprons, we know that they weren't changed. We know overalls weren't changed. You were highly likely in the 1800s to die if you went into hospital. So we're going to talk about one figure in particular that has brought about hygiene and preventing the spread of diseases. We're going to look at 4 figures that have been quite influential. So obviously, as our knowledge and understanding of diseases and illnesses has evolved, so we've evolved from caveman days of I've got a headache, so let's drill the devils out of your head, and moved on to it could be an imbalance of the 4 humours, and then we've gone on to recording illness and observations in the terms of like Hippocrates, but when it came to hygiene, when we're looking at the 1800s, we're still thinking it was like, I think it was called miasma, or bad smells were causing disease to be transmitted. And it took quite a while before we realised exactly how that was done. Literally the last 200 years is when we've really started understanding the cause of diseases and how they've been spread from one person to another. And again, most of these were thought experiments initially that now have gone on to have proven science. So these were your pioneering doctors and scientists. So we've got Ignaz Semmelweis, who the podcast I mentioned is about. And that podcast started because someone put a tweet out saying every day is Semmelweis Day, because of him, we do several rituals, several parts of the day for our own hygiene. And then we've got Louie Pasteur and Joseph Lister, off of Listerine fame, developed our modern understanding of pathogens. So Louie Pasteur was responsible for showing us that pathogens are small and can be moved and trapped in places. History students will know better than me for this, but it's been a long time since I studied that. But we need to understand their ideas. So here they all are. You can have a go at guessing who is who. Looks a bit like John Cleese on the left. Okay, So using the information on these slides, produce a fact file on each of the following pioneers. You should include a brief description of their work and how they contributed. So just pause as we go through. So we're going to do Louie Pasteur. He came up with the pasteurisation process, so boiling to get rid of pathogens. Hence we have pasteurised milk, etc. Listerine, he actually used disinfectants for the first time. Ignace Semmelweis was the first person to come up with hygiene measures in hospitals, and Florence Nightingale, we know, pioneering for her treatment of soldiers. Okay, so let's start with old Florence. So she is the founder of modern nursing, and she organised and cared for the wounded soldiers in the Crimean War. Mortality rate reduced from 42 to 2%, and that was because she introduced hand washing and ventilation between patients. And she did it. She wrote her reports in simple English so everyone could understand what was happening. And she also invented the pie chart. Mr. Casey taught me that. So she could clearly represent ideas that she was making, but washing her hands was something that she did and suggested other people did. Mr. Lister, great. Surgeon and pioneer of antiseptics. So he heard about what Pasteur was up to and applied those to the use of carbolic acid. So he used to clean his equipment in carbolic acid because he noticed that was stopping people from dying, and he used it and sprayed it onto wounds and in the air whilst operating. And he realised that this led to less post-operative infections, people getting infected after surgery. And obviously his first, so Listerine also can be used as well as we use it in our mouth to kill the bacteria in our mouth. So antiseptics kill pathogens, and so he was the first person to be using things to kill pathogens. And now we've got Louie Pasteur. Bonjour, Louie Pasteur. So he, like I said before, was the first one to come up with the idea of living organisms that we couldn't see in germ theory, and he did that with his famous swan-necked beaker. People thought that food used to just go off spontaneously, and he developed the idea of preserving food by pasteurisation. So heating things very rapidly, high temperature, kills the bacteria without destroying the taste. And most of the food that we eat, and milk, for example, is pasteurised before we get it. If that doesn't happen, like milk, for example, would spoil incredibly quickly. He also helped develop vaccines against diseases such as anthrax and rabies. So quite the gent. Semmelweis, very interesting character, Mr. John Cleese. It's not John Cleese. So he was a Hungarian physician. And he worked in a hospital, and he noticed that the women in hospital, if they had their child delivered by a doctor, they were far more likely to die during childbirth or after childbirth, post-childbirth due to infection, than if they were women who had their babies delivered by midwives on the same ward. And he looked into why that was, and he used data to prove his ideas. And doctors in the 1800s would wear a suit and a jacket and a top hat, and they would go and perform surgery on one patient and then move to another patient. So if they were assisting a delivery of childbirth, they would have other people's decaying putrid flesh on them. Particularly, he noticed that there was a real link between people that were doing post-mortems or working on dead bodies and then going and helping with childbirth. So he introduced the scrubbing up routine, and so before he went into the labour wards or into the medical wards, he would, or if he touched a dead body, he would ensure that he washed his hands really, really thoroughly, and the death rate of mothers being delivered by doctors went down, or by himself, went down dramatically. This is the one the podcast is on. It's really, really interesting. And it started with the tweet, "Every day is Semmelweis Day." And at the moment, we're being encouraged to wash our hands and sing happy birthday twice. And this is all because Semmelweis. He wasn't... his work was seen as a bit outlandish and a little bit like he was telling people what to do. He had a very interesting life and ended up dying, I believe, with Alzheimer's, but he was actually committed. But a very interesting character, so I really do suggest that podcast. It is really, really interesting. Have a little think why bear in mind 1800s, early 1800s. Have a little think about why you think that he may have had some opposition. So just as a reminder, it was 20 years later when Louie Pasteur developed his germ theory, and it was about 30 years later, or maybe not, about 30 years later that Lister started using antiseptics, and it was about 10 years later that Florence Nightingale said washing hands was a good idea. So why do you think that they would be so resistant to his ideas? Do excuse the sink, it's making some really fun noises because the dishwasher's on. Okay, do go back if you haven't finished some very brief notes on the past 4 people. So suggest why other doctors were resistant for Semmelweis's ideas, and they really were. He was a bit of a laughing stock, to be honest with you. So pause it here, have a think about why. So here's some answers here. So pathogens are small. So before we didn't have any microscopes, we had no way of seeing them. It made it difficult to understand that disease was spreading. His evidence was seen to channel normal practice because people were slightly offended that they thought that he was causing death. And it took time to build up the evidence and the idea in people's heads that they need to deeply entrench the hand washing technique. Okay, so on the next few slides we've got coming up, we have got 4 headings: hygiene, isolating people, destroying or controlling vectors, and vaccination. And these are the main measures that would be used to prevent the spread of disease. So hygiene is the most basic, isolation, destroying or controlling the vectors, and vaccination is a preventative. So go through these slides, pause them so that you can see them. So I'll leave them on there for a bit. So hand washing, disinfectants, raw meat away from food. You need to know all of these. Catching coughs and sneezes, and maintaining hygiene. So we know the vampire cough, etc. So pause this. The next one is isolating the affected. Now we know that we're going through this all over the world. People are having to self-isolate if they are infected. We have, well, I want to say inverted commas, lockdown, where we are socially distancing from people as well. So social distancing and isolating to stop the spread of disease. I'm going to move on to the next one, so make sure you pause. Vaccination. So to prevent the spread of disease, we would introduce a small amount of the pathogen. Your body will then be immune when it comes into contact with the live pathogen. Really successful way to prevent against serious diseases. It's reasons why we don't see smallpox anymore. It's the reason why we don't see rubella anymore. There has been a resurgence in the MMR, measles, mumps and rubella, because people have stopped taking their vaccines. It's the reason why no one gets diagnosed with polio anymore unless they haven't been immunised. So massively brilliant way of controlling infectious diseases. Destroying or controlling vectors. So particularly when we think about mosquitoes, is a vector for malaria. And things like rats carry the plague and things like that. So if you can control the vectors, what is spreading the disease, then we can reduce the numbers. So for example, we're now breeding mosquitoes that kill the malaria, which is pretty good. And when they breed, they cause other mosquitoes to die. So that's pretty good. Okay. So this is something that you can do in your own time. Take your time, use the information that is on these sheets. So if an epidemic occurs when a communicable disease affects a greater number of people than normal for a particular area, or when a disease spreads to areas that are not normally associated with that disease. If an epidemic spreads worldwide, it's called a pandemic. And guess what? We're in the middle of one right now. This hasn't happened on this scale since 1918, so it's a pretty special time in history. Not a good one, but it is a special time in history. It will be written about. So this is your challenge. You have to think about what the government should have done, or could have done, or would have done, or will be doing. So what we want you to do is to read through the slides on the next few pages. These are about 4 different epidemics. None of these are pandemics, they are epidemics, okay? So none of these are global. The last proper global pandemic probably was the Spanish flu. Choose one of them to advise the public about. You can create a campaign to educate people, poster, leaflet, advert, or all three. If you've got time, it's up to you. Please do send them to us. What causes the disease, what the symptoms are, how to treat the symptoms, and how it's spread. And a preventative technique, how it prevents the pathogen from being spread. So there are swine flu, cholera, Ebola, or MERS, which is Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. So for all of these, all the information you need is on there, but you might want to go one step further and add some details about viruses and things. Remember, the more detail and more explanation, the more because and any links you can make, that will get you your higher grades. Okay, so when you're finished, go through these and see where you rank in those. Are you using scientific knowledge about hygiene and the history of these, and are you applying them to prevent the spread of disease? Please do send in anything that you do on this. So swine flu is actually related to the coronavirus. It's H1N19, I believe, the coronavirus. So this is H1N1. So similar symptoms actually: fatigue, tiredness, aching joints, but this one's more of a cough-based one. Resting at home, preventing it. They did come up with Tamiflu, which was a really good way of protecting those that became infected. Cholera was quite famously solved by Mr. Jon Snow, but not off of nothing Jon Snow fame. First outbreak in the UK, 1831, 50,000 people killed. And they related that to the fact that there was a sewage main and a water main coming into contact. So people were having poor water that had been contaminated. And so they managed to link that. But there's been no reported cases for over 100 years because we know that effective sanitation stops cholera spreading. Ebola, quite famous in the news a few years ago. Usually African countries, more likely, and it also affects primates in a similar way. Direct human-to-human contact or exchange of bodily fluids, so similar. There's no treatment, so you can only treat the symptoms because it's a virus. And MERS, viral respiratory illness again. Again, it's another coronavirus. You can see there it's MERS-CoV, so it's the coronavirus, Latin word for crown, because of the surface proteins again. 2012, there was an epidemic. It's not easily transferred between humans, and that's the difference with this COVID-19, is that it is easily transferred between humans, which is what's caused it to become a pandemic.